April 14, 1945, 1:20 a.m., Zwolle, Netherlands. The German sentry hears the first shots and turns toward the dark street. At first it sounds small, a patrol contact, a few rounds in the night, a shout somewhere beyond the buildings, footsteps on stone, the kind of thing that can still be controlled. A report can be sent, a squad can be moved, a street can be searched, the city can be held. Zwolle is still under German control. The war is almost over, but almost is not safety. A city can die in the final hours. A retreating army can still burn. A nervous soldier can still shoot. A commander with no hope can still order destruction. And in the darkness, nobody knows yet what the next sound means. The sentry listens. Then another burst of fire comes from somewhere else. Not the same street, not the same corner, another direction. Then another sound, a door, a shout, running feet. A report begins to move through the German positions. Canadians may be inside the city. Maybe it is only one scout. Maybe it is a patrol. Maybe the Canadian attack has already begun. No one knows. And in war, what men do not know can become more frightening than what they see. A German defender can understand an attack from outside. Artillery first, then infantry, then armor, then Orjarden shoot through smoke and dust. That kind of assault has shape. It has direction. It has weight. But this is different. The sound is inside the city. The threat is not clearly in front of them. It is around them, behind them. Moving through streets they thought they still controlled. A prisoner is taken. A patrol disappears. Someone says there are more Canadians. Someone else says the firing is spreading. No one can tell if these are separate attacks or echoes of the same one. The darkness makes one sound into many. The streets carry fear from corner to corner. The city that felt occupied a moment ago begins to feel surrounded from within. And somewhere in that darkness is one Canadian soldier, one working eye, one mission that was supposed to be reconnaissance, one dead friend behind him. Léo Major is not commanding an army. He is not leading a battalion. He is not entering Zwolle with tanks, artillery, and columns of infantry behind him in the street. He is moving alone, through darkness, through grief, through enemy uncertainty. He has already lost one eye to the war. Now he is using the night as the other. He fires, he moves, he appears where the enemy does not expect him. And to the Germans trying to understand what is happening, one man is beginning to sound like many. The question sounds almost impossible. How can one soldier fool a city? How can one man, wounded by war, outnumbered, and alone in the streets, create enough confusion to shake a German-held position? How can a reconnaissance mission become one of the most unbelievable Canadian stories of the liberation of the Netherlands? His name was Léo Major, a Canadian soldier from Quebec, a man who had already fought in Normandy, a man who had already been wounded, a man who had lost the use of one eye and still returned to danger. By April 1945, he was part of the Canadian Army, moving through the Netherlands in the final phase of the war in Europe. But this story is not as simple as one man winning a city alone. That would be too easy. And it would not be responsible history. Zwolle was not an empty stage. There were Dutch civilians inside it. There were German defenders still armed. There were Canadian units approaching from outside. There was Dutch resistance watching, waiting, and risking everything. There was a wider campaign moving across the Netherlands as German power collapsed, but had not yet disappeared. That is what makes the story powerful, not because it turns Léo Major into a superhero. He was not. He was a soldier, a wounded soldier, a grieving soldier, a determined soldier. And that is more human than myth. The city of Zwolle was still in danger. When armies approach a defended city, liberation does not always arrive gently. If defenders resist, artillery can follow. Street fighting can follow. Buildings can burn. Civilians can die in the last hours before freedom. That is the cruel truth of war. Sometimes the final night is the most dangerous one. Major's mission was not supposed to be legend. It began as reconnaissance. Find out what the Germans had inside the city. Contact the resistance if possible. Bring back information. Help the Canadians understand whether Zwolle would have to be taken by force. But in the dark, the mission changed. A friend died. A city waited. And one Canadian made a decision that turned information gathering into psychological warfare. The Germans expected a Canadian attack to look like an attack. They expected numbers. They expected formations. They expected pressure from outside the city. What they did not expect was one man inside the city using fear against them, not strength against strength, not army against army, confusion against control. A city can be taken by force. Armies know how to do it. Artillery can pound the edge of a town until walls collapse and defenders crawl through dust. Infantry can move street by street, house by house, room by room. Tanks can push through roads while machine guns uncover windows and intersections. Engineers can clear obstacles. Commanders can draw arrows on maps and order men forward. That is the visible way to break a city. German defenders understood that kind of war. They had seen it. They had used it. They had suffered under it. By 1945, they knew what Allied firepower could do. They knew that once artillery opened, a city could become rubble before first infantrymen reached the street. They knew that a defended position could become a grave. They also knew Canadian infantry was not new to hard fighting. By the spring of 1945, Canadians had fought through Normandy. They had fought through the Scheldt. They had fought in mud, flooded ground, villages, dikes, fields, and towns. They had paid heavily. They had kept moving. This does not mean every German soldier feared Canadians more than every other Allied army. That would need proof. But it does mean German defenders in the Netherlands knew the Canadians approaching them were experienced, tired, and still advancing. The defenders also had another problem: the Dutch resistance. Occupation never meant perfect control. There were civilians who listened, civilians who hid, civilians who carried information, civilians who waited for the moment when German power would break. To an occupier, resistance is frightening because it makes the rear area uncertain. The street may look quiet, the town may look obedient, but someone may be watching from behind a curtain. Someone may know where the Germans sleep. Someone may know which road they use. Someone may be waiting to guide the liberators in. So the German defenders of Zwolle had reason to fear many things: artillery, Canadian infantry, the Dutch resistance, the collapse of the wider front. But Léo Major represented a different kind of threat. He was not a bombardment. He was not a battalion. He was not a tank column rolling into the square. He was hidden movement, a shot from one street, then another, a captured patrol, a rumor, a question: how many Canadians are inside? This was the difference. Artillery destroys with force. Infantry advances with numbers. Armor breaks through with weight. But fear can move faster than all of them. Fear does not need a full report. It needs uncertainty. It needs darkness. It needs one soldier appearing where he should not be. And in Zwolle, the enemy's greatest problem was not that Léo Major had the strength of an army. It was that they did not know he did not. A city can be defended against an army, but panic begins when the defender no longer knows where the army is. Before Zwolle, before the dark streets, before the Germans heard one man and imagined many, Léo Major had already paid a price to the war. He was not a fresh soldier walking into his first danger. He was not untouched by combat. He was a Canadian from Quebec, serving with le Régiment de la Chaudière, a French-Canadian regiment that had crossed the Atlantic and entered the war in Europe with the rest of Canada's fighting army. By the time he reached the Netherlands, he had already seen Normandy. He had already seen what modern war did to men. Normandy was not a clean victory. It was mud, smoke, hedges, machine guns, snipers, mines, shellfire, villages that became battlefields, fields that became cemeteries. For Canadian soldiers landing in France and pushing inland after D-Day, survival was never guaranteed. Every road could be watched. Every hedgerow could hide a weapon. Every quiet moment could break open without warning. Somewhere in that war, Léo Major lost the use of one eye. Many accounts describe the injury as coming from a phosphorus grenade incident after D-Day. The exact details should be verified carefully before the final edit, including the date, location, and which eye was damaged. But the effect is what matters for this story. One eye was gone from the war, and still Major kept fighting. For most men, that kind of wound could have ended frontline service. That would not have been cowardice. It would have been normal. A soldier with one working eye loses depth, loses part of his field of vision, loses certainty in the small things that keep a man alive. How far away is that shape? How close is that wall? Where is the movement in the dark? Where is the muzzle flash? Where is the enemy? But Major did not leave the war behind. This is where his reputation begins to form. Not because he was invincible. He was not. Not because wounds did not matter. They did. Not because fear disappeared. It never does. His reputation came from something harder to explain. Stubbornness, temper, pride, discipline. A refusal to be removed from a war that had already marked him. From the enemy's point of view, a wounded man should become less dangerous. A man with one good eye should be easier to underestimate. A scout with limited vision should be easier to dismiss. But war does not always work that way. Sometimes the damaged man becomes more dangerous because he has already crossed the line other men fear. He has already learned that survival is uncertain. He has already seen what the enemy can do. He has already lost something and kept moving. By 1945, Léo Major was not only a soldier with a wound, he was a soldier with experience, a man used to moving close, a man able to scout, observe, and act without waiting for the battlefield to become safe. And that mattered in Zwolle, because the city would not be taken in daylight parade formation. The night would belong to whoever could move through uncertainty, whoever could read danger with less than perfect sight, whoever could use darkness not as a weakness, but as cover. That is the symbol of this story. One good eye in the dark, not a superpower, not a myth, a wound, a limitation, a reminder that courage often comes from damaged men doing impossible things anyway. And in Zwolle, one good eye would be enough to make a German city question what it was facing. April 1945, the Netherlands was close to liberation, but close is not the same as free. For Dutch civilians, the final weeks of the war were filled with hope and danger at the same time. German power was weakening, but it had not vanished. The front was moving. Allied armies were closing in. Canadian forces were pushing through towns and roads that had lived under occupation for years. Freedom was coming, but it could still arrive through fire. This is the danger of the final days of a war. Everyone knows the end is near, but men can still die. Cities can still burn. Orders can still be given by commanders who know they are losing. A retreating army can still destroy bridges. A nervous soldier can still shoot a civilian. A defended town can still become a battlefield in its last hours before liberation. For the Germans holding positions in the Netherlands, the situation was becoming worse. The war in Europe was collapsing around them. The Allies were inside Germany. The Soviet armies were closing from the east. Hitler's empire was breaking apart, but a soldier inside a Dutch city did not need to believe in final victory to keep fighting. He needed only orders, fear, habit, a weapon in his hands, a commander above him, and the belief that surrender might be more dangerous than another night of resistance. Zwolle was not just a point on a military map. It was a city of civilians, homes, churches, streets, families, people who had survived occupation and were now waiting for the sound of liberation. But liberation could be terrifying before it became joyful. A city defended by Germans and approached by Canadians could face shelling, street fighting, fires, and civilians' casualties. That is what everyone feared. Not only whether Zwolle would be liberated, but how. From outside the city, Canadian commanders needed information. How many Germans were inside? Were they prepared to fight? Where were the positions? Was a heavy assault needed? Could artillery be avoided? Could the city be entered without turning its streets into ruins? These questions were not academic. They were the difference between a city surviving the night and a city paying for its freedom in rubble. This is where reconnaissance matters. Before an army enters, someone has to look. Someone has to move closer than comfort allows. Someone has to risk the dark road, the hidden machine gun, the patrol, the sentry, the sudden burst of fire. Reconnaissance is not glory. It is information bought with fear, and sometimes blood. For the German defenders, any Canadian approach could be understood in military terms. If the Canadians wanted the city, they would come with numbers, infantry, artillery, tanks, orders. The Germans expected pressure from outside. They expected a recognizable attack. They expected the Canadians to behave like an army. But outside Zwolle, two men were about to move forward on a mission that was not supposed to. Become a legend. Léo Major and Wilfrid Arsenault. The city was almost free. but almost could still kill. The mission began in darkness, not with a parade, not with a speech, not with an order to take a city alone. Léo Major and Wilfrid Arsenault moved towards Zwolle as scouts. Their task was not legend, it was reconnaissance. Find out what the Germans had. Learn how strong the defense was. See what waited inside or near the city. Contact the Dutch resistance if possible. Bring back information, that matters. Because the legend of Léo Major can become so large that it hides the truth of the mission. He was not sent forward as a one-man army. He was not ordered to perform a miracle. He and Arsenault were doing one of the most dangerous jobs in war, going ahead of the force, moving into uncertainty, walking closer to the enemy so others would know what waited there. A scout lives in the space before battle, too far ahead to feel safe, too close to pretend the enemy is somewhere else. Every sound becomes important. A branch, a boot, a dog, a bolt moving in a weapon, a voice carried by the wind. The night does not help the scout relax. It helps him survive while making every shadow look alive. From the German side, a small reconnaissance patrol should be manageable. If it is detected, fire on it. If it withdraws, the line holds. If one man is hit, the other may run back. If both are killed or captured, the Canadians lose their eyes for the night. That is how defenders think. Stop the scout, and you delay the attack. Stop the scout, and you keep the city hidden a little longer. Major and Arsenault kept moving. The city ahead was occupied. The road was dangerous. The Germans were still there. And somewhere in that darkness, the mission moved from military procedure into personal history. Because reconnaissance depends on returning. Information matters only if someone brings it back. A dead scout cannot report. A captured scout may reveal more than he means to. A wounded scout may never reach the line. There is a cruel loneliness in a mission like this. Behind them are Canadian lines. Ahead is the enemy city. Between the two is the place where men disappear. No crowd will see what they do. No civilian will know their names as they move through the dark. No historian can safely invent their words. Only the shape of the mission is clear. 2 Canadians were sent forward. One of them would not return. The enemy expected a scout patrol to break if hit hard enough. That expectation was reasonable. Most men, under sudden machine gun fire in the dark, would look for cover, survival, withdrawal, and the fastest path back to their own lines. There is no shame in that. That is war. But the night outside Zwolle would not follow the normal logic of war. It would break one man and send the other forward. Then the night broke open. Machine gun fire cut through the darkness. Not distant, not imagined. Close enough to tear the mission apart. The sound was sudden and violent. The kind of sound that leaves no time for heroic thought. Only reaction, only instinct, only the body trying to survive before the mind understands what has happened. Wilfrid Arsenault was hit. The mission had been reconnaissance, gather information, assess the German defense, contact the Dutch resistance if possible, return to Canadian lines. That was the logic. That was the order. That was what should have happened. But war does not always follow the line drawn on a map. Sometimes one burst of fire changes the entire meaning of a night. Major was now alone. Behind him was the friend who would not finish the mission. Ahead of him was Zwolle, a German-held city, civilians inside, enemy troops somewhere in the streets, Canadian forces outside, waiting for information that might decide whether the city would be entered carefully or taken by heavier force. The reasonable decision would have been to pull back, report what happened, survive. There would have been no shame in that. One scout alone in the dark does not owe history a miracle. From the German side, the expectation was simple. The patrol had been stopped. The Canadians had been checked. The small threat had been broken. A dead scout and a surviving scout should mean retreat. That is how a defender thinks. Hit the patrol hard enough, and the patrol withdraws. Force the enemy back into caution. Keep the city hidden. Keep the line intact. But Léo Major did not move away. The night changed inside him. This must be handled carefully, not as a joke, not as revenge fantasy, not as an action scene where grief becomes entertainment. A man was dead, a friend was gone, and Major had to carry that loss in the same darkness where the mission still lived. Grief does not always make a man louder. Sometimes it makes him colder, more focused, more dangerous. He was not invincible. He was alone. He could be killed by the next burst. He could be captured. He could disappear before the city ever knew his name. Every street ahead could hold a patrol. Every window could hide a gun. Every wrong turn could become the end. But he still had something the Germans did not understand. He had darkness. He had movement. He had surprise. And he had the enemy's own uncertainty waiting inside the city. Major chose to go forward. Not with an army. Not with a plan big enough to explain what would happen next. But with a decision. If the Germans expected the reconnaissance patrol to break, then the surviving scout would become the thing they did not expect. One man entering the city, one good eye in the dark, one dead friend behind him, and a German defense that believed the threat had just been stopped. Inside Zwolle, darkness became a weapon. Not because darkness made Major safe. It did not. Darkness hides the enemy as much as it hides the scout. It makes every street uncertain, every doorway suspicious, every window a possible muzzle. But darkness also gives a single man a chance to become more than one man in the enemy's imagination. Major moved through the city, street to street, corner to corner, changing position, creating noise, forcing the Germans to listen without understanding. In daylight, one soldier can be counted. In darkness, one shot can become a patrol. One burst can become a section. One captured German can become proof that the Canadians are already inside. This was not the power of numbers. It was the power of uncertainty. The Germans did not know what he was. A scout? A patrol? The first wave? A sign that Canadian units had slipped into the city? Every report made the night larger. Every sound added weight to the illusion. Major used movement the way artillery uses impact, not to destroy entire streets, but to spread the sense that danger was everywhere. He fired, then moved, appeared, then disappeared, pressed one point, then shifted to another. The city carried the sound for him. Stone walls, narrow streets, open squares, windows, alleys. Every surface helped the noise travel. The enemy expected a soldier to hold ground. Major did not need to hold ground. The enemy expected a patrol to stay together. Major was alone. The enemy expected an attack to have a clear direction. Major made the direction unclear. That was the deception. Not a perfect plan written in advance. Not a guaranteed trick. A dangerous improvisation in a city where confusion could do what numbers could not. Accounts of this night describe Major capturing German soldiers and using the situation to reinforce the impression that Canadian forces were entering in strength. The exact number of prisoners varies between retellings and should be verified before final publication. Some accounts also describe him using gunfire, grenades, or fires to spread panic and convince defenders that a larger force was present. These details should be checked carefully before using them as exact sequence. But the broader effect is the heart of the story. The Germans were being forced to answer a question they could not answer quickly enough. How many Canadians are inside Zwolle? For a defender, uncertainty is poison. If you know the enemy is one man, you hunt him. If you know the enemy is a platoon, you organize against it. If you know the enemy is outside the city, you face outward. But if you do not know where the enemy is, or how many there are, or whether the attack has already begun behind you, then every decision becomes slower. Every shadow becomes information. Every shout becomes evidence. Every absence becomes a threat. Major's lack of numbers became less important than the enemy's lack of clarity. That is why this story is not just about bravery. It is about battlefield psychology. A city at night can multiply fear. A single man can use that fear if he keeps moving. And, in Zwolle, Major moved enough that the Germans could not reduce him back down to one man. The enemy wanted order. Major gave them disorder. The enemy wanted a line. Major gave them scattered sound. The enemy wanted to know where the Canadians were. Major made them wonder if the Canadians were already everywhere. That was the night's strange power. One man was not stronger than a garrison. But for a few crucial hours, one man could make a garrison question itself. A city at night is not empty. Even when the streets are quiet, even when the windows are dark, even when civilians are hidden behind doors, listening and waiting, a city is full of sound. Footsteps, echoes, distant voices, a door closing, a shot that seems to come from one street, then another. In Zwolle, the city itself became part of the deception. Urban fighting is confusing even when armies are involved. Buildings break sight lines. Alleys hide movement. Streets bend sound. A muzzle flash, he appears and disappears before anyone knows where it came from. A man can be 20 meters away and feel invisible. A squad can be a block away and feel like an army. Now imagine that confusion not with a battalion inside the city, but with one moving scout. For German defenders, this was the worst kind of uncertainty. The Canadians were outside, that much was known. But now the sounds were inside. If Canadians were already inside the city, then the defense had been penetrated. If the defense had been penetrated, then every position might be exposed. If every position was exposed, then holding the city might become a trap. This is how fear begins to turn a place against its own defenders. The same streets that offered cover now become blind corners. The same buildings that offered shelter now become possible hiding places. The same civilian windows that had seemed silent now seem watchful. The same night that protected German movement now protects the Canadian moving among them. And the Germans had another reason to doubt. By April 1945, the war was collapsing. German forces across Europe were retreating, surrendering, or fighting in isolated pockets. The defenders in Zwolle were not standing at the beginning of a confident empire. They were standing near the end of a defeated one. That matters. A strong army can absorb confusion. A collapsing army can be broken by it. The question inside the German defense was no longer only tactical. It was psychological. Is this the main attack? Are the Canadians already in force? Will artillery follow? Will we be cut off? Will holding this city achieve anything except more death? Every answer was uncertain. And uncertainty, in the final days of a losing war, can become heavier than orders. The Dutch civilians inside Zwolle were not simply background. They were living through the last hours of occupation. They had heard German boots in their streets for years. They had lived under rules, fear, shortage, and waiting. Now they heard gunfire in the night and had to ask what it meant. Liberation? A battle? A massacre? A bombardment? Another final act of violence before freedom? This is why the story must not become only a legend about one man. Zwolle was full of people, families, children, resistance contacts, civilians who had already endured too much. The city was not a stage for heroism. It was a living place at risk. Major's actions mattered because they happened inside that risk. Not because he made war look easy, but because he helped turn the enemy's uncertainty into a chance for the city. The German defenders had to decide whether Zwolle was still worth holding, and Major's movement through the city made that decision harder. If they stayed, they might face Canadians already inside and more coming from outside. If they resisted, they might bring artillery and destruction onto the city. If they withdrew, the city might survive. This was the impossible terrain of the story. Not mountains, not beaches, not flooded fields. A city at night, a city full of civilians, a city full of echoes, a city where one Canadian with one good eye made the defender wonder whether the battle had already been lost. For the German defenders in Zwolle, the question was no longer simple. It was no longer only, where are the Canadians? It was, are they already inside? That question changes everything. A defender can face an attack from the outside. He can aim toward the road. He can watch the west edge of the city. He can wait for artillery. He can prepare for infantry moving in from a known direction. But if the enemy is already inside the city, the map begins to fail. The street behind you becomes dangerous. The alley beside you becomes dangerous. The building across the square becomes dangerous. Even silence becomes dangerous. Reports move through the dark. A shot in one street, movement in another. A German patrol that does not return. A prisoner taken. Another burst of fire. Another rumor. Canadians are inside. Maybe many. Maybe only a few. Maybe the first wave of an assault. Maybe the city is already being entered from more than one direction. This is where Major's deception attacked something. More important than a single position. It attacked command confidence. An officer can give orders when he understands the battlefield. He can tell men where to face, where to reinforce, where to withdraw, where to hold. But when the threat has no clear shape, every order becomes a risk. Send men one way, and the enemy may be behind them. Hold position, and the city may close around them. Withdraw too late, and the roads may be cut. A soldier can fight an enemy he sees. He can fire at a muzzle flash. He can hold a doorway. He can defend a corner. But he fears the enemy he cannot locate. The one who appears, disappears, and leaves only evidence that he was there. The one who makes a patrol vanish. The one who makes the night sound like the beginning of an assault. And outside Zwolle, the larger war was already turning against Germany. This was not 1940. This was not the beginning of conquest. This was April 1945. The German army was losing Europe. The Allies were advancing. The Canadian forces outside the city were not a rumor. They were real. They were close. And every sound inside Zwolle could be interpreted as proof that the end had already entered the streets. That is the enemy realization, not respect in a clean, cinematic way. Not a neat moment where a German officer admits defeat in a line someone wrote down. There is no need to invent that. The realization is tactical, psychological, human. If Canadians are already inside, if the city is no longer secure, if the wider front is collapsing, then holding Zwolle may no longer mean defense. It may mean being trapped inside the last hours of a lost war. The German hold on the city begins to weaken. Not because one man has the firepower of an army. He does not. Not because the defenders have no weapons. They do. Not because the danger is gone. It is not. But because Major has forced the question every defender fears. What if the battle has already moved behind us? If the Germans believe the city is already infiltrated, then the next question is no longer how to win. It is how to get out. Then morning came, and Zwolle was still standing. That is the part of the story that matters most. Not only the legend, not only the gunfire, not only the one-eyed Canadian moving through the streets. The city was still there. Its streets had not been turned into a full battlefield. Its buildings had not been reduced by a large bombardment. Its civilians had survived another night. For people who had lived under occupation, that was not a small thing. That was everything. By daylight, the shape of the night became clearer. German resistance had weakened, withdrawn, or collapsed enough that Canadian forces could enter the city without the kind of heavy assault that many feared. The exact wording should be checked against the strongest sources before final edit. But the emotional truth is powerful. Zwolle did not have to be destroyed in order to be freed. Canadian forces entered from outside. Dutch civilians emerged from inside. The occupation was ending. The fear that had lived in the streets for years began to break. Windows opened. Doors opened. People came out carefully at first because even joy can be cautious after years of danger. Then the meaning of the morning became clear. The Germans were no longer holding the city as they had the night before. Liberation had arrived, but this moment should not be told as if only one person mattered. That would be a weaker story. The stronger story is the true one. Léo Major mattered. Wilfrid Arsenault mattered. The Canadian units outside Zwolle mattered. The Dutch resistance mattered. The civilians who endured occupation mattered. The wider Canadian liberation of the Netherlands mattered. A city is not saved by myth alone. It is saved by decisions, risks, timing, fear, courage, and sometimes by a strange night when one man's actions make a larger battle less necessary. Arsenault should not be forgotten in this story. He did not live to see the morning. His death is part of the cost behind the legend. Every heroic story in war casts a shadow, and that shadow often has a name. Wilfrid Arsenault was that name in the night outside Zwolle, and Major carried that shadow into the city. He did not enter as an untouched hero. He entered as a wounded soldier, a grieving soldier, a man already marked by war, a man who could still be killed at any corner. That is why the story lasts. Not because it is clean, but because it is almost impossible and still human. Accounts of Zwolle emphasize that his reconnaissance and actions helped show that the city could be entered without a large-scale bombardment or assault. That wording should be verified carefully before final publication, because it is the heart of the claim. But even with caution, the arc remains extraordinary. A mission meant to gather information became a night of deception. A German-held city became uncertain. A single scout became the sound of a larger force. And by morning, the city was spared the worst possible ending. For the German defenders, the night had become too unclear. For the Canadians, the city became reachable. For the Dutch, liberation became real. That is the climax. Not how many enemies were killed, not how loud the gunfire was, not how impossible the legend became over time. The climax is this: Zwolle survived. One soldier's night, a city's morning, returned to the dark street, returned to the first shots, returned to the German sentry, listening in the night. At the beginning, the sound was only confusion, a few rounds, a shout, footsteps, a report that did not yet make sense. But by the end of the night, that confusion had become something larger. To the defenders, one man had sounded like many. To the city, danger had begun turning into liberation. Léo Major was not invincible. He was not a myth walking untouched through war. He was wounded. He was tired. He was angry. He was grieving. He was human. That matters. Because human courage is stronger than superhero legend. A superhero cannot teach us much about fear. A wounded soldier can. He had lost one eye to the war. He had lost a friend outside Zwolle. He could have died in the next street. He could have been captured. He could have disappeared into the same darkness that helped him move, but he went forward. And for a few hours, one good eye in the dark was enough. Enough to move, enough to see danger before it closed, enough to turn enemy uncertainty against itself, enough to help make a city believe an army had arrived. But this ending belongs to more than one man. It belongs to Wilfrid Arsenault, who did not return. It belongs to the Canadian soldiers outside the city, ready to enter the Netherlands one town at a time. It belongs to the Dutch resistance and civilians who lived under occupation and still hoped for freedom. It belongs to Zwolle, a city that remembered. That is why the story should be told with care. Not as a claim that one man won everything alone, not as a cartoon of war, not as a legend stripped of cost, but as something better, a real soldier, a real city, a real night, a moment when courage, grief, deception, and timing came together before dawn. The Germans heard an army. History remembers the one Canadian moving through the night. He had lost one eye to the war. But in Zwolle, one eye was enough to make a city believe an army had arrived. And by morning, the city was still standing, lest we forget.